Let me tell you a crazy story about something that just happened to me. So I've got an electric toothbrush. It goes and stuff, and it's so much better than an ordinary toothbrush where I have to move it back and forth with my dweeby little hands. Except lately I actually have had to use the boring toothbrushes that I move with my dweeby little hands because I lost my electric toothbrush. Or so I thought. I was like, I don't even take this thing out of my apartment. It doesn't leave my bathroom. There's an extremely limited number of places it could be. How the hell does my electric toothbrush just vanish? I was traveling recently, but I didn't bring my electric toothbrush along because I was going to fly for part of that, and I'm not sure what the status of its battery vis-a-vis putting it in luggage is. For that trip, I had bought some toothbrushes while I was there, so at least I had some toothbrushes to use instead. And by the way, isn't it funny that the plural of toothbrush is toothbrushes? It doesn't sound right. Toothbrushes sounds like something adorably incorrect a 4-year-old would say. It should be something like tush breath. Well, anyway, you won't believe where I ended up finding my electric toothbrush. That, boys and girls, was a jump scare. So called because it makes you jump. Did you jump? Did you have some kind of startle response? You should have. If not, you should get that checked out. Why did you jump? It's common for a doctor to test your reflexes by hitting your patellar tendon below your knee, which causes your muscles in your lower leg to contract and your foot to kick forward. It's easy to think of reflexes that way, as a purely mechanical feature of the tendons and bones and nerves that make up your body. No more thought going on there than there is in a car moving forward when you step on the gas. But reflexes involve thinking too, very fast thinking. You jumped because you thought you were being attacked, and then you realized it wasn't a real threat. It was just a loud noise and a scary 3D rendering of Jollibee. But did that occur to you? Did the thought cross your mind? Wait, my previous impression of an imminent threat was wrong. That is merely digital art of an anthropomorphic durian upon the screen of my personal computing device. Of course you didn't. You heard the noise, saw the scary Jollibee, your brain assessed that as a threat, you jumped, and then your brain said, false alarm, nothing to see here. And you kept watching, without it ever really occurring to you that any of those thoughts were being thunk. When you jumped just now, there was thought going on in your brain, just not conscious thought. So much of your life is not consciously experienced, and you can establish how much by asking people things they don't realize they don't know. The electric toothbrush story I opened with was a red herring, but in writing it, I realized I don't know what color my actual toothbrush is. Do you? I use it twice a day, but I cannot describe it beyond it's a toothbrush. You can go through life without ever thinking consciously about important parts of it. I'll never know what color the toothbrush I threw away before this one was. If that somehow came up in conversation, I'd probably say I forgot, but I didn't forget. I never had a conscious thought about the color of my toothbrush. How far does this extend? Having a bunch of autistic special interests that I pay attention to, and being around people who have special interests that I don't share, has made me realize just how much of the world we miss. One of my special interests that I'm not sure I've ever mentioned before is airline routes and schedules. So when someone says they flew somewhere exotic, I'll often ask them, oh, what airline did you fly on? And often the answer is, they don't remember. So then I'll ask, what airports did you fly through? And then I can often guess the airlines from the route, but sometimes people don't even remember that. As a teenager, I'd often drive from Eugene to Portland to pick up my dad after he came back from a business trip, and on the drive home I'd ask him, what airports did you go through? And sometimes he didn't know. He's a frequent enough flyer that he didn't consciously think about his route at all, but he successfully got home. You can input information into your brain without thinking about it. Is it possible to go through life, doing everything a normal life would entail, hardly ever coming across as weird to the people you meet, without being conscious? Most philosophers and psychologists say yes, though not all. A person who isn't conscious but outwardly seems to be is called a philosophical zombie. I already brought up the concept of philosophical zombies, P-zombies as they are known in the biz, in an episode a few months ago that was about the different cultural ways we perceive and define color. A P-zombie could look at Jollibee, see the yellow wavelength hitting its eyes, and say, that's a yellow durian. And I'd say, it certainly is, my conscious friend who has internal subjective experience. Only it would know that it doesn't have internal subjective experience, and By definition, you can't know that. Can you have an entire society of pea zombies? One that seems from outward experience to be completely normal, but inside the heads of the citizens, everyone is just perceiving everything the way I perceive my toothbrush, where the actions are taking place but without the experience of them, where there's nothing that it's like to be these people? One man, in one of the most controversial and unusual history books of the 20th century, claims that not only is this possible, it was the default state of humanity for thousands of years. Let's talk to some gods. But first, you don't need internal subjective experience to enjoy the Tor store. Does this Jollibee sweatshirt make you feel hot, or is that just a mechanical function of your thermoreceptor nerves? It doesn't matter. Does this poster of Thimble and her sisters look cool, or does it look cool? Even a zombie can tell. Here's an idea for a little game you can play. Pretend to be a pea zombie and start talking to people on the Tor's Cabinet Discord. See how long it takes for people to notice anything's up. Join the Discord by contributing to the Tor's Cabinet Patreon. Patreon.com/Tor's Cabinet. Also get extra curiosities on Patreon, discounts for the Tor store, live streams, and starting very soon, early release videos. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Durian, Thimble the Doll, and Sluds the Shoggoth, and you are currently experiencing the mysterious Torness of Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. The world ended in 1200 BCE. Within the span of a few years, the Fertile Crescent, the area comprising the early civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and modern-day Greece and Turkey, fell into total war and anarchy, the likes of which had never been seen before in human history, and, in terms of how universal it was, may never be seen again. A cascading series of collapses rolled across the Near East, not all happening at the same time, but more of a gradual chain reaction. Nearly every major city on the Mediterranean was destroyed or abandoned within a span of 50 years. Millions became refugees. Some of these probably took to boats, and with no other chance at a comfortable life, became pirates, the infamous Sea People, ransacking the few ports where the social order remained intact, further spreading the collapse. If you were an alien studiously observing the world at this time, it must have seemed like the 1,000-year experiment in human civilization. Agriculture, cities, writing, money, governments had simply failed. That was the end of that, and now it was back to the hunter-gatherer days. That seems to be what lots of people thought at the time. 90% of settlements in some parts of Greece were abandoned. Entire written languages were forgotten. What happened? Historians point to a variety of causes: plague, volcanic climate change, even improvements in metalworking that allowed barbarians to make better weapons to plunder the cities with, but no one explanation answers everything. Civilization gradually clawed its way back. Some kingdoms, like Egypt, survived more or less intact, poorer and weaker, but retaining the same power structure they'd had before the collapse. Over the centuries of recovery, the late Bronze Age collapse left psychological scars on the people who came after. Nearly every society of the Near East developed a myth of a historic golden age when everything was better, perceiving the world around them as quite literally post-apocalyptic, fallen, forsaken by the gods. This last part was very important. In the Golden Age, everyone insisted, the gods were down here with us. Now they retreated to somewhere. Where the gods were now depended on the culture, but one part was universal. The gods have abandoned us. In the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, we see the first recorded prayers that match their modern form, begging a deity to be with us. Older prayers thank the gods, they ask them to do specific things, but they never ask for the presence of the gods. That's just assumed. Demons make their first appearance. Before the collapse, there's barely any documentation of a belief in demons. Oracles become widespread, omens too. People start trying divination from fire, water, stars, animal guts, everything and anything, practices that again didn't seem to exist before the collapse. A tablet from the reign of Tukulti, a king of Babylon, right around the time of the collapse, describes this process in language that couldn't be clearer. The author of this tablet, a minor feudal lord, writes about his increasingly desperate attempts to bring the gods back, as if he's an eyewitness to a major historical event like a battle or an earthquake. In this tablet, the gods' abandonment of the Babylonians very much doesn't seem to be a metaphor. There's no reference to war or plague or any of the other catastrophes said to have caused the Bronze Age collapse, at least not at first. This poor guy was punished by the king for an unnamed transgression, and the moment that happened, his personal gods deserted him. He describes it very matter-of-factly. Normally, he prays, and the gods respond. Until suddenly, one day, no response came. My God rejected me, he disappeared. My goddess left, she departed from my side. The protective spirit of good fortune who was at my side split off. My divine guardian became terrified and sought out another. This doesn't feel like the process of a modern-day religious person losing their faith. He still has his faith. He's still feverishly praying, desperately trying to bring his gods back. His gods used to be right by his side, offering him advice, and all of a sudden, to his surprise, they're gone. He has no idea what happened. He resorts to all the methods I already described and more. The diviner could not determine the situation with divination. The dream interpreter could not clarify my case with incense. I prayed to the dream god, but he did not open my ear. The exorcist with his rituals did not release the divine anger against me. So we're in a world where being deserted by the gods is a thing that can happen to people. So we've already invented all these other pseudo-religious rituals which are attempts to bring the gods back. Once the collapse fully got underway, these would become what religion is made of. Our poor nobleman is trying all these methods, still believing that he might get a response like the ones he used to know, and when the gods respond, he'll know. But he keeps on getting the silent treatment from the gods that he insists used to literally answer his prayers. And then the word gets out among the populace that the local lord's gods have deserted him, and then a popular uprising brews against him, leading to anarchy and collapse. Plenty of other sources from around the time of the Bronze Age collapse have this exact narrative. First, the gods abandoned us, before anything else bad had happened. The disappearance of the gods, independent from any other tangible event, was a specific thing. One by one, we all noticed this happen to us. And then we saw wars and famines and societal collapse as a reaction to the disappearance of the gods. But it is a metaphor, of course, right? I mean, there weren't literally gods or godlike beings on Earth before the Bronze Age collapse. Don't worry, I'm not going there. This isn't going to be about ancient aliens or anything. It's arguably weirder, because it's not only religion that has changed in the aftermath of the collapse. Religion has changed, sure. Pre-collapse Near Eastern temples were oriented around a big idol that was treated as a literal physical god. There were daily sacrifices to it, but they weren't that ritualistic. If anything, they were very unceremonious. You fed the god like you feed your cat. In most city-states in Mesopotamia, attendants would bring in bread and cakes and meat for the god, and then leave, for the god to enjoy the meal. The famous Babylonian king Hammurabi sent the following message about bringing the idols from a conquered fiefdom to Babylon. I am sending now Zikir-Elisu the officer, and Hammurabi Bani the Dugab officer, to bring the goddesses of Emutbalum. Let the goddesses travel in a processional boat, as in a shrine, as they come to Babylon. For the food of the goddesses, you shall provide sheep. Even though these goddesses belonged to a conquered city-state, even while they were just being shipped, they had to be fed, because of course they did. They were living gods, right? In some places, idols were even periodically carried to a temple of another god, one that they were married to in the mythology, for a conjugal visit. A curtain was closed, it was assumed the gods were having sex, and then after a few hours, the idol would go back home, carried on the shoulders of its human, self-described slaves. After the collapse, this was completely inverted. What was worshipped was the absence of the gods, sometimes in a very literal sense. The tablet I described from the reign of Tukulti seemed to take place at a time when the gods had already deserted most people. At the time the gods went silent for this nobleman, the question, what do you do when the gods stop answering your prayers, was already something of a hot-button issue in Mesopotamia, and the answer usually appears to have been, beg for them to come back. An engraving of the king Tukulti shows him kneeling before an empty throne, representing his god that has disappeared. Depicting a king prostrating himself like this would be an unthinkable act of desperation in previous eras of Mesopotamia. The king was a god himself, or at least closer to the gods, until, it seems, during the reign of Tukulti, the world broke, and now he wasn't. But there's another thing that noticeably changes after the Bronze Age collapse. All of a sudden, texts have much more complex emotion in them. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see new post-collapse retellings feature Gilgamesh pondering his inner thoughts after his friend Enkidu died. Why is thy heart so sad? And why are thy features so distorted? Why is there woe in thy heart? And why is thy face like unto one who has made a far journey? This introspection doesn't appear in earlier versions of the epic. In an earlier version called the Yale Tablet, Gilgamesh is still mourning, but he treats grief as something external imposed on him. Over in Greece, the Iliad has a similarly alien conceptualization of emotions. There is no word in the Iliad that directly corresponds to mind or thinking. The equivalent words refer literally to body parts as the source of emotions or ideas, and when characters are uncertain or confused about something, that's consistently portrayed as competing emotions rising from different parts of their body, seemingly without their control, which is certainly a way you could describe emotions today, but it feels very autistic, I guess you could say. Like you're a puppet of your separate, unknowable emotions. In the post-collapse version of Gilgamesh, as well as the Odyssey, which was most likely written much later than the Iliad, despite also being attributed to the probably mythical Homer, our hero's internal monologue feels achingly human. Pre-collapse, characters don't really have internal monologues such as we think of them. And from what we can tell, real people seem to have more coherent internal monologues too, post-collapse, or at least they're writing about it more. Pre-collapse writings are extremely direct and matter-of-fact. Here's a letter from Hammurabi to a vassal king in the 1700s BCE. I wrote you telling you to send Enubi Marduk to me. Why then haven't you sent him? When you see this tablet, send Enubi Marduk into my presence. See that he travels night and day, that he may arrive swiftly. No reason given for Enubi Marduk being summoned, nothing subjective whatsoever. Compare this to a letter from an unnamed Assyrian king about 1,000 years later. So help you heaven, have turned yourselves into Babylonians, and you keep bringing up against my servants charges, false charges, which you and your master have concocted. The document, nothing but windy words and importunities, which you have sent me, I am returning to you, after replacing it into its seals. So much more personality, subjectivity, theory of mind for other people right there on display. On its own, this isn't evidence for anything, but it's interesting how consistent the shift is. Before the collapse, writings are dry and direct and don't really seem to acknowledge that other people have unique minds. After it, like flipping on a light switch, we suddenly get emotional complexity. What's going on? Enter Julian Jaynes. He was a big deal in the mid-20th century, one of those consummate academics of an old-school tradition, with such a broad range of interests and specialties that rather than calling him anything specific, like a psychologist or a classicist, he's best described simply as an intellectual. Jaynes taught psychology at Princeton from the 60s through 90s, but also studied ancient languages and made his own translations of Homer. In the 50s, when Jaynes was a lecturer at Yale, he had become interested in the work of Roger Sperry, who discovered a lot of what we now know about the difference between the left brain and the right brain, and later won a Nobel Prize for it. Through experiments on people who had undergone a surgical procedure for epilepsy, where they'd had most of the nerves connecting the two halves of their brain cut, Sperry found that the two hemispheres of the brain can each effectively function as their own brain, except for a handful of important functions like language, which seems to be localized to the left brain. One of Sperry's weirdest findings was that the right brain can interpret signals and function perfectly well on its own, but not in a way we would perceive as conscious. Here's what he did. Confusingly, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and vice versa. Again, Sperry was working with people who had had the connections severed between their left and right brain, which is still done today as a treatment for severe epilepsy and has fewer side effects than you'd think. But this means that these patients' brains couldn't share information between halves, so everything they saw from the left side of their field of view, with both eyes, was processed only by the right side of their brain, and vice versa. Sperry had his patients put their left hand, again, the one controlled by the right side of their brain, the side that doesn't process language, on a tray of random objects. They could touch the tray, but not see it. And then he showed them a word corresponding to one of the objects on the tray on the left side of their field of view. The people would then grab that object, but if they were asked what word they were just shown, they'd say that they hadn't seen a word at all and couldn't explain why they were holding the object in question. So the right hemisphere can perceive language, but cannot generate it. Back to Julian Jaynes. After years of study and rumors that he was working on something truly revolutionary, or insane, in 1976, Jaynes published the book that would become synonymous with his name, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Nonfiction books still had dry titles like that. Today it would be something like, Are You There, God? It's Me, Nebuchadnezzar, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. This is his theory. In ancient civilizations, everyone was constantly hallucinating a god talking to them, coming out of their right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, the human side, then acted in response to what the god in the same brain was telling them. That's how you get a concept of personal or household gods, which almost all early civilizations had. It's also how you get theocratic god kings, something also found in almost all early civilizations. If your culture tells you that the voice in your head is the pharaoh talking to you, giving you instructions, of course you'll build some pyramids for him. It's why there doesn't seem to be any introspection, any concept of a mind as something people have in literature before the Bronze Age collapse. It's why archaeologists find so many idols in excavating Bronze Age homes, because those were used to channel and amplify the hallucinated voices of the gods. Plenty of ancient sources describe people talking to an idol, either in their home or at a temple, and directly receiving advice. Most people say this is metaphorical, not Jaynes. A Sumerian proverb went, "Act promptly, make your god happy." What does that mean? In Jaynes's view, it means do what the god's voice in your head is telling you to do, without thinking about it. Then, societies became too complicated for this state of affairs to hold, and that's when you get The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Title drop. Trade blossomed between empires, and with it the need to understand other people's minds. The more aware you become of your own awareness, the less you just react to whatever the god in your head tells you to do, and so the less you hear your god. Jaynes postulates that the lowest people on the social ladder were the first to lose their gods and become fully conscious. If you're a thief or a pirate, having a detailed understanding of your actions makes it easier to deceive people. If you're a king, keeping your populace in line by telling them that your voice, which is also the voice of a god, is constantly talking to them all, your kingdom can only grow so much before it gets too big and diverse for everyone to be hallucinating the same gods you tell them to hallucinate. So, probably over the course of centuries predating the Bronze Age collapse, consciousness as we know it gradually trickled up. Some people were distressed by this and resorted to superstition to bring back the gods. Then, after possibly a couple hundred years, where only the nobility still had bicameral minds, since they were seen as closer to the gods in the first place, they lost their gods too, and almost all of humanity was conscious. Once the lords and kings lost their gods, society erupted into chaos, because now the gods had abandoned them. Long after the collapse, a few people retained the old bicameral mind, and they were sought out. That's why that period was the golden age of oracles. The Oracle of Delphi was the most powerful and trusted authority in Greece for centuries, and it wasn't a hereditary position. Every time a new Oracle of Delphi had to be named, it was the result of a search across Greece for someone who still heard the gods loud and clear. The modern pop culture interpretation of the Oracle of Delphi is that she was tripping, because some sources mention her breathing in vapors coming out of the rock before she makes a prophecy, but archaeological evidence around Delphi suggests that there probably wasn't any geothermal activity around there 2,000 years ago, and there's no known gas that could naturally come out of the rock that could bring on hallucinations of gods. Jaynes believes that the Oracle of Delphi was one of the last authorities of the age of the bicameral mind. Why is idolatry a sin in the Abrahamic religions? What's so bad about idols? Because, Jaynes suggests, early Judaism was the first post-bicameral religion to rise in the Near East, telling people that the gods have not abandoned us, God is in heaven and still loves us, and you just have to have faith. But in order to have faith, you can't just be talking to other spirits all the time. Throw away your idols and embrace full consciousness. Plenty of passages in the Old Testament only seem to make sense if you interpret them in the context of a world where some people still have bicameral mentalities and talk to idols and hear them respond. Leviticus 20:27 calls for the death of anyone who has a, quote, familiar spirit, and in Deuteronomy, the same Hebrew word translated as familiar spirit is something people consult with, mentioned in the same breath as necromancy. The physical composition of the brain did not change. A scan of an ancient Babylonian's brain would look exactly the same as that of a modern human, says Jaynes, but it did not work the same way. Consciousness was an invention, and a relatively recent one. To Jaynes, religion as we know it is a vestige of the bicameral mind. We were gods once, or rather, our right brains were. Then we learned that that's just our own fallible mind. The fall of man. No wonder so many societies the world over have myths about being abandoned by the gods, or about a moment, like the apple in the Garden of Eden, where suddenly humanity gained knowledge of itself. In Jaynes's words, quote, prophets, poets, oracles, diviners, statue cults, mediums, astrologers, inspired saints, demon possession, tarot cards, Ouija boards, popes, and peyote are all the residue of bicamerality that was progressively narrowed down as uncertainties piled on uncertainties. This is ridiculous, right? I mean, for one thing, if Jaynes was right, there would still be a handful of people around today who still have bicameral minds. If this was the default mode of organization for the human mind for the first 1,000 years of civilization, clearly some people's minds would end up working this way regardless of what the dominant culture tells you to think. Maybe we'd treat them as crazy, but people would exist who are constantly listening to hallucinated gods talking to them. And there are! What do you think schizophrenia is? Schizophrenics hear hallucinated voices. These voices tell them to do things. Often the voices manifest as a god or an authority figure. The voices heard in schizophrenia usually tell the sufferer to do dangerous or self-destructive things, but not always. Jaynes cites an example of a woman who says that her voices were offering her advice to improve her life, advice that actually worked, and thought that the government was beaming these messages into people's heads in order to improve the public's mental health. Thought, all right, well, one of the gods are here. One of my sound deadening panels just fell off the wall. Anyway, thought that the government was beaming these messages into people's heads in order to improve the public's mental health, for which she was very grateful, a hilarious inversion of the usual stereotypes of schizophrenia. This definitely isn't the norm, but Jaynes suggests that if you had a society where schizophrenia was the norm, as he claims Bronze Age civilizations were, it wouldn't just be a mess of everyone's voices telling them to wreak havoc. The nature of schizophrenic hallucinations is very susceptible to suggestion. Schizophrenics today wouldn't all believe they're telepathically communicating with the CIA or aliens if those weren't already tropes in pop culture. Schizophrenics who were raised Christian believe Jesus is talking to them. If you were raised in a culture that tells you that's Zeus talking to you, and that's perfectly normal, you'll go through life being puppeted by the voice of Zeus. A conscious, non-bicameral person might do all the same things you do through conscious decision, but you feel like you're doing it because Zeus tells you to. Jaynes doesn't stop there. The opening lines of the Iliad are, "Sing, O Muse." Several times after the poem reaches a conclusive line, the line is repeated, as if begging the muses to continue. Plato wrote that great poets don't actually write poetry, they get possessed by the muses, who write poetry through them. Again, most historians say this is metaphorical. Jaynes says otherwise. He cites a procedure called the WADA test, used in epilepsy patients before the aforementioned hemisphere severing surgery to determine which hemisphere of their brain is dominant. In a WADA test, half the brain is put to sleep at a time. Typically, when only the patient's right brain is active, they can sing but not talk. When the left brain is active, the patient can talk but not sing. Music and rhythm seem to come from the right brain, the place where Jaynes says bicameral hallucinations come from. Poetry is an incarnation of the bicameral god. Jaynes barely touches on societies outside the Western classical world in his book, but I think there's weak evidence, at the very least, that this happened further afield. In traditional Chinese religion, your ancestors take the role of personal household gods. Ancestor worship takes place through shunjupai, or spirit tablets, wooden tablets of varying sizes with the ancestor's name engraved on them. Ancient sources say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that ancestors talk to us through the tablets. You're used to this refrain by now. Most historians say this is metaphorical. I'm sure Julian Jaynes, if asked, would say otherwise. When Jaynes described Babylonian idols being carted around across the city to visit other idols, I immediately thought of another ancient religious oddity I've already done an episode on, the Hindu god Jagannath. That's a ritual continuing to this day where an idol of a god is carried from one temple to another to visit another god. I talk about this in more detail in the episode itself. Pause this video and check it out if you'd like. But Jagannath is very unique and unlike other Hindu gods in a lot of different ways. One being the simplicity with which he's portrayed, with those giant haunting eyes. I talked about how Jagannath's giant eyes work on the concept of darshan, visually seeing divinity, like the giant eyes of those Mesopotamian statuettes that were supposedly used to channel the bicameral mind. Everything about the worship of Jagannath seems like a pretty clear-cut example of a surviving vestige of the bicameral mind. A book that Jaynes aficionados will constantly recommend, one that's also about very weird pre-modern psychology and seems to corroborate some of Jaynes' theories, is written by someone who doesn't seem to be familiar with Jaynes, is Don't Sleep There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett, about his years living among the Pirahã people of the Amazon rainforest. I'm pretty sure I pronounced Pirahã right, but it's spelled like piranha without the N. They live approximately around here, along the Meitze River, which I probably also mispronounced. Now, we've already told more or less this story on Tor's Cabinet before, in the episode about Louis Sarno. A weird, adventurous American leaves the country, goes out into a malarial jungle in search of one of the most remote and prehistoric societies in the world, finds them, attempts to integrate into their culture, commits various social faux pas, but eventually becomes accepted as one of their tribe. Years later, he comes back to America and writes a book about everything they've taught him about humanity. Now, Louis Sarno went to live among the pygmies of the Central African Republic because he was drawn to their music. In his book, Song from the Forest, he describes the pygmies' amazing ethereal vocal performances, their dances with elaborate costumes evoking figures from their legends, and at one point, a funeral with haunting, mournful singing that goes on for days. It's clear to anyone they have a rich culture. The Pirahã are different. The Pirahã are as weird to other semi-contacted Amazonian tribes as all Amazonian tribes are to Americans. According to Everett, and I acknowledge that this is difficult to believe, the Pirahã have almost no material culture. They have no music, no concept of fiction, no real visual art, and very few rituals. Funerals consist of burying the body so it doesn't spread disease, and then everyone gets on with their lives. Marriage exists, but not weddings. You get married by deciding to live together, and you get divorced by deciding to live with someone else. I feel like clearly they must have some form of art or ritual, just in ways Westerners and, it seems, other Amazonians can't understand, but if Everett is even partially right, it upends everything anthropologists think they know about cultural universals. Another thing I've talked about before in multiple previous episodes is how successful anarchic societies are actually stiflingly conformist. In pre-agricultural societies, there really aren't any leaders. People are happy, peaceful, and truly anarchic, but that's because the tribe is small and tight-knit enough that everyone enforces social rules against everyone else. Where there are no cops, everyone is a cop. Nearly everyone who has done what Sarno and Everett did has written about this, but Everett writes about the Pirahã enforcing their social contract in terms that feel extremely Jaynesian. Spirits can tell the village what it should not have done or what it should not do. Spirits can single out individuals or simply talk to the group as a whole. Pirahã listen carefully and often follow the exhortations of the Kawaibogi. A spirit might say something like, "Don't want Jesus, he is not Pirahã," or "Don't hunt down river tomorrow," or things that are commonly shared values, such as "Don't eat snakes." Through spirits, ostracism, food sharing regulation, and so on, Pirahã society disciplines itself. The original thing that drew Everett to the Pirahã was Christianity. He was a missionary, from a missionary family. He brought his wife, 3 kids, and their dog along to live with the Pirahã. But he began to struggle with his own faith as he found the Pirahã nearly impossible to evangelize. He assumed that since the Pirahã are always talking about spirits, well, clearly he's not totally starting from square one. They're deeply spiritual people, so it should be easy enough to introduce them to Christian concepts of spirituality. But he was wrong. In the sense of believing in God or gods, the Pirahã seemed to be atheists. To the Pirahã, the spirit world was an extremely concrete fact about their daily lives. Spirits were something you'd encounter in the jungle, just like dangerous snakes and tasty tapirs to hunt. Seen through Pirahã eyes, the perception of Everett went something like, imagine if you and your friends were visited by an alien who said she wanted to live alongside you and learn about human culture. In this world, everyone knows aliens exist and sometimes visit Earth, but nobody knows much about them, and your new friend is definitely the first alien you've encountered, let alone one who's trying to learn English and relate to humans. And one day you sprain your ankle running up a downward escalator or something, your doctor puts a boot on your foot, and your alien friend is like, "What's that?" So you explain that you hurt your leg and had to go to the doctor, and the alien says, "Oh, cool, you have a doctor. My people have a doctor who heals our wounds too. Every time I get sick or get hurt, I get perfect free care from my doctor, and I'm always good as new." This sounds pretty nice to you, so you ask to meet this alien doctor, and your alien friend is confused. You don't meet him, she says. You have to try really hard to clear your mind and not think about what's ailing you, and then if you're good enough at doing that, the doctor will visit you in the night and you'll be healed. There's only one doctor on the home planet, and he obviously doesn't have a physical form and can't be directly interacted with. The alien describes this as if it's the most normal thing in the world. That's how it works for humans, right? And you say no. You schedule an appointment online, you go to a clinic, you show them your insurance card, and then a person comes into the room, tells you what's wrong with you and how to fix it. Now it's your alien friend's turn to be baffled. "And it actually helps," she says. "Of course it does," you say, pointing to the boot on your foot. "Where do you think this came from?" The prologue of Don't Sleep There Are Snakes describes the entire population of Everett's village yelling and pointing at an unremarkable patch of beach along the river, where they all claim a specific named spirit is standing. They act like it's a huge deal. Everyone in the village claims to see him right there looking at them. Everett and his kids see nothing. So, I'm far from the first person to suggest that the root of everything unique about the Pirahã is because they're a bicameral society. Somehow, they've remained deep enough in the jungle that they've never had enough contact with the outside world to collapse their brains into full consciousness. But the more Everett writes about the Pirahã, the less clear that becomes. For one thing, he later learns that most of the Pirahã's interactions with spirits take place in their dreams. And in other cases, they perceive ordinary animals and plants in the jungle as also simultaneously being spirits. So they're animists. And besides, Jaynes himself didn't think tribal societies like the Pirahã were bicameral at all. He believed that the bicameral mind arose in response to the pressures of living in an early agricultural society, and hunter-gatherers were pre-bicameral, a type of mentality that he didn't dwell much on but seems to believe was even weirder and less conscious. Jaynes wrote that, quote, "The smooth working of a bicameral kingdom has to rest on its authoritarian hierarchy." The very point of societies like the Pirahã is that they don't have an authoritarian hierarchy. There's a strong version and a weak version of Jaynes' theory. It's a bit of a Mott and Bailey argument, where you claim something outrageous and then backtrack and go, "When I said that, clearly what I meant was..." Such is Jaynes' decision to make the book about consciousness, the origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. The idea that ancient people conceptualized their minds very differently, possibly interpreting some signals as a god talking to you, is the weak version of the theory. Maybe this is true. Even the idea that everyone in pre-Bronze Age collapsed societies was what we'd now call schizophrenic, which is something Jaynes directly says, is the weak version. The strong version of the theory, quite harder for me to believe, is that this is where consciousness comes from. That not only was everyone in Mesopotamia schizophrenic, they were pea-zombies with no internal experience. Does Jaynes believe that schizophrenic people today aren't conscious? That seems to follow from what he's written. Jaynes devotes the first third of his book, before getting into any historical evidence of his theory, to arguments like the ones I started the episode with, summarizable as, what is consciousness? Well, whatever it is, it's a lot narrower than you think. A popular definition of consciousness is being aware of your own awareness. This seems to be the definition Jaynes goes with, hammering in his point that you're not as aware of your own awareness as you think. Okay, sure, I'll take that, but Jaynes repeatedly asserts that people before the Bronze Age collapse were unable to comprehend other minds, were unable to deceive each other, lived so thoroughly in the moment that they didn't really have memories, and did not have a concept of good and evil. This can't possibly be true. Chimps deceive each other. But Jaynes himself studied animal behavior for years. That was another one of his specialties. I don't know how I can reconcile that with his very explicit claims that people in the first civilizations were not conscious and could not understand other people's minds. Jaynes cherry picks a lot of his evidence too. In fact, reading the book itself, after having read numerous reviews of it and commentary on the theory, I was surprised at the weakness of the evidence presented in the book. Jaynes kind of seems like he's just assuming his theory is true from the start and then examines everything else he knows about the ancient world with his mind already made up. When Egypt stopped building pyramids and just buried their kings in unmarked tombs, he says that's not just because of grave robbing, it's because the people were no longer hearing the divine hallucinated voice of the pharaoh in their heads, so they no longer felt like building huge monuments for him. But at the same time the Egyptians stopped building pyramids, over in Mesopotamia they began building ever taller and more grandiose ziggurats, and Jaynes interprets this as evidence for his theory too, for the opposite reason. The disappearance of the gods made people desperate, and so they built more and more monuments to entice the gods back to Earth. Neurology has made more leaps than Spring-Heeled Jack since the 1970s, and not entirely in directions that corroborate Jaynes' theories. Schizophrenic hallucinations are generally understood today to come from the left brain, from Wernicke's area, the same area where language itself comes from. If the bicameral mind is a thing, maybe it's not related to schizophrenia after all. As you either already know or have already guessed, I'm autistic, and for reasons not really understood by modern science, autism seems to be the opposite of schizophrenia. The odds of one negatively correlate with the odds of the other, and as you'll see, my autistic mind has occasionally fired in a rather Jaynesian way. Since Jaynes wrote his book, scholarship has also evolved on the Bronze Age collapse, with lots of serious historians questioning the narrative that Jaynes and I gave of it. In broad strokes, there definitely was an increase in violence and a decline in living standards, as well as noticeable declines in markers of civilization like trade and literacy across the Near East, starting around 1200 BCE, but it may not have been as fast, as apocalyptic, or as absolute as historians used to think. Some cities managed to completely avoid destruction and soldiered on. And the real elephant in the room, the book is completely centered around the world of classical antiquity, the early civilizations of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. What about China? What about India? When does Jaynes think they transitioned from bicameral to conscious? Doesn't get a mention. As far as I know, no other ancient civilizations have a body of literature from around a particular time where everyone starts freaking out about how the gods suddenly disappeared. I can maybe map the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven, or as I prefer to translate it, mandate of the cosmos, to the bicameral mind. When you no longer hear the voice of the god emperor giving you instructions, that means he's lost the mandate of the cosmos. He's just some guy now, and it's time to revolt. But that's a stretch. Jaynes doesn't mention anything close, and it doesn't explain why every Chinese dynasty eventually lost the mandate of the cosmos to someone else. Becoming conscious is a trick you can only nail once. Jaynes does say that the Aztecs and Incas were bicameral societies right up until the conquistadors arrived, which is how the Spanish managed to conquer them so easily. This feels right to me. The Mesoamerican civilizations had features that strike me as similar to the Mesopotamians. If Babylon was bicameral, I can believe Tenochtitlan was, but was the Spanish conquest of the Americas that easy? The Aztecs, in particular, won a bunch of major battles against the Spanish, and ultimately only collapsed because of diseases the Spanish accidentally brought. Jaynes died in 1997, still insisting he was right, but that most people criticizing his theory hadn't really read his book, and those who hadn't really understood it. I feel for him because I think I agree that most people are misinterpreting it. Jaynes seems too knowledgeable about his subject to actually be claiming something so weird. I'm aware of the adage that being smart doesn't make you more right, it just makes you wrong in more interesting ways. In fact, I said that in a conversation a few weeks ago in some other context, and a friend of mine out of the blue said, "You know what that reminds me of? Julian Jaynes and the bicameral mind theory. Heard of it?" But despite all this, I can't bring myself to say Jaynes is entirely wrong. And that's because, until a specific moment in early summer 2010, not long before I turned 9 years old, I was a bicameral mind. I thought of it this way at the time. Until many years later, I assumed it was an ordinary step in brain development, something that happens to everyone if they think about it. I don't have many specific tangible memories of that summer, but I do remember how all of a sudden it felt like everything had changed, like I'd shifted into a higher resolution version of the universe, like I'd gained some greater awareness and wasn't really a kid anymore, or at least that's how I thought of it at the time. I started to form a friend group, something I hadn't even wanted before that. I started thinking seriously about my future. I don't think I even had a concept of a future before then, or at least hadn't thought about it too deeply. And even then, even at 9 years old, I found myself wondering, what just happened to me? What great change just came over me? Something had definitely happened, something completely intangible, so difficult to describe I never even tried to tell anyone else about it until now. And then I realized, I don't hear Other Tor anymore. Other Tor is gone. Or rather, and this is really the way I thought of it when I was 9, Other Tor has fused with me, and I now realize Other Tor was me all along. I can make my own decisions. The wise voice that used to explain to me what to do was completely gone, and more surprisingly, I felt ready for that. I couldn't have imagined living without Other Tor until then, and I'm sure the prospect that Other Tor could vanish never crossed my mind before. But now I suddenly knew that Other Tor was my own internal monologue, and then and there, I felt like I'd become a full human being. Now I was living life in 3D. Now I could pay attention to things, understand other people better, form more coherent memories. But I was conscious before I was 9, and I'm pretty damn sure I wasn't schizophrenic either. That typically shows up in your early 20s if you have it. I had interpreted my inner monologue as something of an imaginary friend, and that had worked until, like the poor Mesopotamian lord, the world became too complicated to see it that way. I believe that Jaynes found something real, but shot himself in the foot by deciding what he'd discovered was a story about consciousness. Perhaps it would work better, as Scott Alexander suggested when he reviewed Jaynes's book, as a story about theory of mind. I'm going to leave the room for a second, and while I'm at it, I'm going to put Jollibee in my backpack. Don't worry, man. It's real comfortable. Back in a sec. When Tor comes back into the room, where will he look for Jollibee? A. In the backpack. B. In the microwave. Let's find out. All right, Jollibee. Hope you enjoyed your stay in the backpack. Wait! Where's Jollibee? Oh, hi, London. Wait, where did you take Jollibee?
Oh, I put him in the microwave.
Oh, no, don't do that. No matter how much he begs for it, it's bad for him. I've gotten him down to 1 microwave a week, and if we do any more, he'll relapse. I can't afford to send him back to rehab. No, I'm sorry.
Jollibee.
That test probably wasn't too hard for you, was it? You knew I didn't know London had put Jollibee in the microwave. I still thought he was in the backpack. You know that because you have theory of mind. You understand that minds are separate, personal, and subjective. I have my thoughts in my mind, you have yours, and nobody else can get into our minds. That specific test, someone puts down an object, leaves the room, someone else comes in, moves the object. When the first person comes back in, where will they look for the object? That's called the Sally Ann test, and it's a test for young children's theory of mind. Autistic kids take a much longer time to grasp that the first person doesn't know their object has been moved. I think before I was 9, when I was still listening to other Tor, I would have guessed that when I came back into the room, I'd immediately know that Jollibee is in the microwave. I can say with not total confidence, but enough confidence, that humans have been conscious since long before we began to plow the fields. But I don't know if we've always conceptualized theory of mind the same way. The mind can do extraordinary things. I have an internal monologue, so do you. It's more or less in your control because that voice is you and there's nothing divided about your consciousness. But if I'd been raised in a culture that tells me that inner voice is a god, presumably I'd have found that very intuitive. That's not other Tor, that's Zeus. And I'd adopt a conception of what other Tor sounds like and tells me to do that matches what I expect of Zeus. I think it's inherent to see your inner monologue as an external authority figure, not just because of my experience, but because of the experience of people in life or death scenarios. The third man effect, as it's known, is a comforting presence commonly perceived in situations like battles, car crashes, terrorist attacks, climbing accidents, even dissuading people from attempting to end their lives. The explorer Ernest Shackleton was one of the first to describe a third man effect during his insane, harrowing trek across Antarctica, specifically describing a, quote, divine presence following his party. Most stories of the third man are anecdotal, and it's difficult to study, but it's well established enough in accounts from people who didn't know about it before. It seems to be a real thing your brain can summon at its darkest hour. And what about psychedelics? There are some drugs almost guaranteed to produce what feels like an encounter with the divine, something that feels so thoroughly like a god that people refuse to believe it's just a hallucination. Jaynes probably wasn't right about the origin of consciousness, but he may have been touching a proverbial part of the elephant, as it were. It's possible to tell yourself that there's another person in your mind. It seems to be a built-in feature of the human brain. If your culture tells you to see that voice as a god, it's very easy to see it as a god. We seem to be born with gods within us. And that, too, isn't really a metaphor.